It's great pleasure to have here two very distinguished guests. Hello, Nick Srnicek, or Nick Srnicek, sorry, and of course Helen Hester. You may change your position behind the screen, but maybe we'll even talk about that. To just very briefly introduce you, maybe the audience already is acquainted with your book After Work, History of the Home and the Fight for Free Time, that has been translated into Czech this year. But of course, you have far larger body of work. You may be already well established through your collaboration with Alex Williams and your work on post-capitalist imaginaries and political economy. And Helen Hester may be through her work on gender and sex, and particularly collaboration of Laboria Kubunix and this kind of famous xenofeminist manifesto. You yourself being an author of the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics. So maybe we'll come even to this context of your earlier work. But without any further addition, let me just give you the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you to everybody who helped to organize this and put it all together. I'll see if I can share my slides here. Okay. So like I mentioned, or like Václav mentioned, Helen's going to be joining us a bit later. The situation we have here is, well, we have 3 children together, which means trying to do a talk and look after 3 children requires one of us to be always making sure that they're safe and sound. So about halfway through this talk, Helen will come in, present a little bit, and then I'll return for the conclusion and for the Q&A as well. So yeah, without further ado, today I'm going to be talking about the futures of work, which is largely focused around our book and the sort of material that we set out there. So today I want to open with a simple but essential question. How will we spend our time in the future? Now, if we look to some of the leading thinkers of the past, they believe that we would spend our time in leisure, pursuing our own interests and furthering the development of humanity. Thinkers such as Karl Marx, William Morris, and Bertrand Russell all saw the expansion of free time as a core part of a future society. John Maynard Keynes famously wrote in 1930 that if economic development continued, that in 100 years, we would only have to work 15 hours per week. The rest of our time would be to ourselves. The contrast with how we think about the future today couldn't be starker. In recent years, this optimistic vision of free time has been usurped by a fear of the impacts of automation. Many have forecast that an inevitable wave of automation based around new developments in machine learning and robotics is set to swamp the labor market and dramatically reduce the number of jobs available for humans. Rather than a future where everyone's basic needs are met and we're free to spend a growing portion of our lives doing what we want, now the worry is that AI and robots will throw workers into unemployment lines where a growing population struggles to make ends meet. Politicians and economists have often responded to this threat by arguing that we need to retrain workers for the digital age. This has meant a new focus on getting people educated in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but also business management programs and learning how to program. But our first key argument is that undercurrent trends, our most likely future involves spending our time caring, not coding. The evidence suggests that the future of work is increasingly oriented around the labor of social reproduction, which is to say, the work of cooking, cleaning, and caring that goes into reproducing a society. And in fact, many countries already spend a vast amount of time doing this sort of work. If we look at paid labor, for instance, social reproduction is a major source of jobs. The NHS, for example, is among the biggest employers in the world. And this graph here shows that these jobs have been taking up an increasing proportion of the economy. If social reproduction were considered its own sector, it would be recognized as the dominant source of jobs in the wealthy countries. To give a comparison, at its peak, American manufacturing employed about 30% of the labor force. Social reproduction is set to soon surpass that figure. So if we once spoke of manufacturing powerhouses, now we need to speak of social reproduction in the same terms. Crucially, these numbers only look set to grow in the future. Looking at the US government's projections for job growth, one journalist recently noted that 9 of the 12 fastest growing fields are different ways of saying nurse. In the UK, government forecasts are that 47% of new jobs are set to be in social reproduction. Everywhere we look, social reproduction is becoming the main sector of the waged economy. This becomes even more significant when we start to include all the unwaged work done towards social reproduction. By our calculations, unwaged work, most of which is social reproduction work, takes up around 50% of society's total working time. Put simply, reproductive labor of some kind, whether waged or unwaged, increasingly takes up most of our collective working lives. A large part of this has to do with changing demographics. In most parts of the world, populations are getting older on average. Fertility is decreasing, which means there are fewer younger people. People are living longer, and this means that the working age population has peaked in many countries, with a growing proportion of elderly and younger people becoming dependent on them. Another reason why we're seeing so much of this work is that it's difficult to automate in general. Care work tends to require significant social skills and empathy, and tasks like cleaning a house involve complex dexterity that's beyond the reach of robots so far. The work is notoriously immune to the productivity improvements that the same way that manufacturing might be. And as a result, as manufacturing becomes more automated, workers are pushed into these sorts of personal services. So, if we return to my initial question, we therefore have a first answer. We'll spend a large part of our future time, both paid and unpaid, doing reproductive labor. Now, there are a number of problems that arise from this future. First, this work is typically unpaid or paid very low. Second, the demand for this work is outpacing the supply, and many people are being left neglected. Third, this work is distributed in highly unequal ways, across genders most notably, but also across classes. And fourth, this work is often mentally and emotionally exhausting. We may be spending our future, therefore, doing work that is difficult, often exhausting, low paid, and where the burden largely falls upon women. So the question is, can we imagine a different way to spend our future time? In our work, Helen and I's, we ask, can we address the secular changes bringing about the need for more reproductive work, while also retaining the hopes of traditional post-work thinkers? Combining these two perspectives, though, turns out to be more difficult than we might imagine. And in fact, when we look at the history of this work in the home, it turns out to be stubbornly resistant to any sort of reduction in time spent. Take domestic technology, for instance. In post-work visions, technology looms large because it promises to facilitate both an increase in living standards and a decrease in the time spent working. And in the 20th century, the home underwent a radical technological change as it became industrialized. Homes became connected, sewers, water lines, electricity, gas, and new devices emerged to take advantage of these novel domestic flows. So we get things like washers and dryers, dishwashers, vacuums, fridges, freezers, and so on. This was a period when the home saw all sorts of new labor-saving technologies introduced. Now, in the 1970s, a number of researchers, most notably Ruth Schwartz-Cohen, started to look at the amount of time that housewives were performing in the home compared to pre-industrial periods. It would seem obvious that all of these new technologies would have reduced the amount of work that women were doing in the home. And yet, when researchers actually looked at the data, that wasn't the case. A housewife of the time in the 1970s was working just as much as a housewife in the 1900s. All of that new domestic technology had barely made a dent in the amount of domestic work being performed. things haven't gotten much better since that pioneering research either. Even to this day, various studies find that there have been changes in the type of work done in the home. So we do less cooking in the home, for instance, and there's changes in who does this work. So we're getting closer to gender equity. But when we look at the average person, we still do around 25 hours of domestic work, which is roughly the same as we did about a century ago. Domestic technology, therefore, hasn't fulfilled its promise of freedom. Why is this the case? Now, there are a variety of reasons, but a key one has to do with rising expectations. So for Cohen, new scientific discourses around hygiene spurred on a slew of new work, and they intermingled with class-based and racially biased ideas around cleanliness. New devices might have made cleaning the home easier, but social expectations around how clean your home was supposed to be rose alongside them. The result was that people used the new technologies to keep things cleaner rather than to get more free time. In the words of one historian, laundry went from being a weekly nightmare to an unending task. It's not just cleaning, though, as social norms exist around every aspect of reproductive labor. From ideas about how to raise children, social expectations about looking after the elderly, norms around cooking and eating, and so on, all of these are shaped in turn by different cultures, scientific discourses, advertiser budgets, and much more. There's a major story to be told about the history of these norms and how they have changed over time. And it's these sorts of social norms which help explain how and why the vacuums of free time have been taken up by, well, vacuuming. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Helen and go look after the children.
Hi, how are you doing? Okay. Right, so I'm just going to pick up where Nick left off. I'm sorry that you can't have the two of us simultaneously, but that is half of the problem with another key reason why reproductive work in the home has been stubbornly resistant to reduction, which is the social unit that's devoted to providing it, the nuclear family. While there is considerable diversity in terms of how people actually organise their domestic lives, the nuclear family continues to be widely celebrated in Western countries as a cultural ideal. And it's really actively reinforced by a broad range of state policies. Yet, in terms of reproductive work, the family is wildly inefficient, and it's a vast repository of gendered inequalities. Women, of course, remain responsible for the bulk of unwaged social reproduction, even as their hours in the waged workplace are increasingly brought in line with men's. But there are qualitative differences to consider when it comes to work within the family too. So studies of childcare, for example, comparatively enjoyable work of talk-based, educational and recreational activities. Mothers end up doing more of the sort of mundane, physical and logistical caregiving tasks. So, it's mums who are sort of brushing teeth and wiping bottoms and doing sort of a lot of the nocturnal caregiving work as well, waking up at night, taking care of the children when they have a bad dream or when they wet the bed. And dads are doing more sort of engaging, recreational, educational kind of developmental activities. So even the types of work being done in the home can be quite unequal. It's not just a matter of the hours that are spent, but the kind of qualities of time, though. The nuclear family is a highly inefficient way to provide reproductive labour. So as Cohen notes, nuclear families in and of themselves invite a massive duplication of effort. So a quote from her up on the screen here, which hopefully you can all read, says, "Out there in the land of household work, there are small industrial plants which sit idle for the better part of every working day. There are expensive pieces of highly mechanized equipment which only get used once or twice a month. There are consumption units which weekly trundle out to their markets to buy 8 ounces of this non-perishable product and 12 ounces of that one." And also the fact is that there's a lack of meaningful alternatives to the family. And that means that for many people, really, the family is the only source of care available. I think we could see this very clearly during the coronavirus pandemic. The state simply assumed that the family would pick up the extra burdens of work as social institutions like schools and nurseries closed down temporarily. More broadly, though, the family has always been positioned as the carer of last resort. It's the institution underwriting all our systems of social reproduction. In an emergency, people, most often women, are expected to cut back their hours in employment and to step into more care-focused roles. So, they will be the ones tending to ailing elders, looking after chronically ill family members, or, taking care of very young children, for example. The end result is both a reassertion of the necessity of the family, because where else are people going to obtain this necessary care, and an intensification of its labours. Ever more responsibilities are being assigned to it. So it ends up being a really intense kind of work unit. For all these reasons, the reliance on the family to provide reproductive labour means that there are hard limits to reducing the amount of work that society devotes to it. Okay, a final core reason for why reproductive work remains so predominant has to do with the spaces in which this work is provided. So this is the final of the four substantive chapters of After Work is dedicated to space. As 1940s property magnate William J. Levitt pointed out, no man who owns his own house and lot can be a communist. He has too much to do. Owning one's own house, particularly if it's the kind of single-family home that's so dominant in America and elsewhere, means a significant expansion of workloads. So that might be maintenance of the house, sort of upkeep, DIY, making sure there are no structural issues. It might be keeping lawns nice and neat and tidy with sort of lovely stripes running across them. It's also working to pay off the mortgage and things like that. In other words, housing has been used to perpetuate a particular configuration of values around things like hard work and busyness and individualism, self-reliance and family structure. And this model was actually quite actively exported by the US during the Cold War. So most famously, we see this in the so-called kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev. This is where the US approach to domesticity was explicitly contrasted to that of Soviet Russia, and really ideological back, all within this exhibition of a model kitchen. But the ideas were also exported via the housing support that the US offered its allies during the bipolar period. The focus of international aid certain kind of domestic imaginary. So we call this domestic realism, the phenomenon whereby the isolated dwelling and the concomitant privatization of household labor becomes so accepted, so commonplace, that it's almost impossible to imagine that this should be the case despite many people's lived experiences of the pressures and the difficulties attendant upon unpaid domestic work, just makes such an attitude all the more remarkable. So, what are the alternatives to this? In the book, we set out 3 broad principles for thinking around how we can organise a future of social reproduction in such a way that it maximises freedom. And these are communal care, public luxury, and temporal sovereignty. So I'm just going to take these in turn. So let's start with communal care. This is our response to some of the problems commonly associated with the family as it stands. So today, as I've kind of touched on a little bit, and we do obviously in a lot more detail in the book, the family is a system of privatized care, massively overburdened by the demands that we place upon it. It cannot and should not be the sole linchpin for managing so many of our caring needs in society. We instead need to foster the transformation and expansion of caring relations. And this is what communal care really invokes. So I think there are two aspects to this idea. The first is a reduction of the pressures that compel people to live or stay in nuclear family households. So this would mean challenging state policies that currently privilege the family at the expense of other ways of living. These are things like policies around child custody, power of attorney, social security, and things like that. So our argument arrangements, and to ensure that such arrangements are not unfairly penalised in one way or another. Second, communal care also requires building alternative institutions, the kind of alternative institutions required to enable new approaches to care to flourish. So let's take childcare, for example. In the kind of society that we're envisioning, much greater support for communal childcare would be available, in particular in the form of high quality, 24-hour universal childcare. And there are some recent models from which years. High quality daycare is now guaranteed and heavily subsidized by the state, and for the poorest in society, access is free. And staff are mostly professionalized and mostly decently paid, while a large portion of government financed care is organized by the voluntary non-profit sector. Now, these examples are not perfect. I don't want to suggest that they are simply something we wish to replicate wholesale and then say, okay, that's great, we're done. Things like ensuring adequate provision and universal access remains a real problem, as I believe it does where you are. But these examples nevertheless point to what it might mean to communalize this one aspect. Is public luxury. Public luxury aims at providing the infrastructure needed for social reproduction and the maximization of free time. And this is infrastructure that goes beyond the mere basics. So the idea extends to things like wonderful parks and playgrounds, public sports centres and swimming pools, galleries, allotments, and public transport networks. While public provision, particularly in places like the US and the UK, is often seen really as a last resort. These are sort of the backstops, the low quality backups to be endured only by the poorest in society who have no other choice. Public luxury specifically demands more. So, and we can easily draw inspiration from places like Helsinki's lavish Oodi library, from Moscow's famous metro stations, and from stylish public housing in Brussels, from America's large public pools, and from Argentina's social tourism initiative. So this is where the state actually built and subsidized large luxury hotels to help working class families take vacations for the first time. And there are all sorts of other examples we could draw upon, but in the interests of sort of expediency, in the interests of time, let's look at one example to help us illustrate this idea. What would public luxury look like in the realm of cooking and eating? Well, as a first stage, we might imagine universal free school meals and breakfast clubs being provided for primary and secondary school students. So Finland, for example, has had a free school meal program in place since the 1940s, with children from sort of pre-kindergarten, the very, very little ones, up to the end of secondary school, all provided with a free healthy meal. Such steps would be significant for time saving, of course, but In line with this idea of public luxury, these meals could also offer children far more nutritious and indeed delicious options. Beyond this, we might imagine communal kitchens. These are a really important resource, I think, for those times when cooking just feels more like a burden than it does a pleasure. One source of inspiration here can be found in Britain's public canteens from World War II. This time period is mostly thought of as one of food rations, one of household scarcity, and of course it was that. But the war was also a period during which some of Britain's very poorest actually ate better than they typically had. This is because, in response to the problems of feeding the population during wartime, the British government established and subsidised a programme of public kitchens, which were designed to provide, these healthy, nutritious meals. Some of these canteens had table service, others were organised, a little bit more like a cafeteria, and many had services via which people could order their food to go and take it home. At their peak, these kitchens were producing around 4 million meals every week. And remarkably, some of them had their walls decorated with works of art taken from Buckingham Palace and the National Galleries. I think this is perhaps as good an example of the principle of public luxury as one is likely to find. So cooking is currently wildly inefficient. It's wasteful of food, wasteful of time, wasteful of energy, but there are plenty of interesting alternatives from which we might learn as we look elsewhere, we look into the past. So I'm going to hand back over to Nick, who's going to land the talk. And thank you so much for having me. I could hear a crying baby, and I'm going to go and deal with that now. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, I've left Helen with a crying baby now. So let me get on to the last principle that we want to talk about, which is temporal sovereignty. Everything that Helen just talked about brings us back to the initial question that we posed. How will we spend our free time in the future? Now, the principle of temporal sovereignty says that we should maximize our free time, the time within which we are freely able to deliberate and choose what to do with our lives. As the philosopher Martin Hagelin writes, if it were given what we should do, what we should say, and whom we should love, in short, if it were given what we should do with our time, we would not be free. Now, in a future organized around the minimization of necessary labor, we would be faced with the immense question of our own desires. What do we want to do? As Keynes argued, for the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. So for Keynes, this was nothing less than an existential issue for humanity. But temporal sovereignty is not simply about freedom from society, but instead about the freedom to create our own norms and obligations. This means having to coordinate socially amongst ourselves and creating the rules that we freely take up. It also means having to deliberate and negotiate between competing values. If capitalism reduces all values down to their monetary equivalent, it is only after capitalism that we can actually freely choose between values. To give a brief example, we can easily imagine values that might contradict the simple goal of minimizing necessary labor. So if, for instance, in a post-capitalist society, thinking about how do you want to organize childcare, on one hand, we might imagine a large public institution supplying childcare, which might be able to minimize work as much as possible by mobilizing efficiencies of scale. But such an institution might also conflict with values around democracy, accountability, and flexibility. So a future society might instead choose to build more localized and cooperative forms of childcare, even if those options meant more work had to be done by society. So these sorts of trade-offs between values would exist throughout a world organized around free time. And temporal sovereignty is all about building the institutions to navigate through these trade-offs. So in order to foster deliberation and negotiate between values, the principle of temporal sovereignty demands that we build new democratic methods and new democratic institutions. We need to imagine a massive expansion of democratic opportunities for people to have a voice in the norms and rules which govern their lives. Ultimately, what matters is not so much the endless reduction of necessary labor per se, but instead the cultivation of time and institutions through which we might consciously and collectively guide the development of humanity. The goal of minimizing necessary labor in order to expand the realm of freedom is simply a condition for being able to ask these questions in a substantial way. Or to put it in another way, we need the freedom to determine the necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Helen, for like very kindly convincing talk. We experienced slight issues with the internet connection, but I think all the arguments were pretty clear. Before we even open up the discussion for public, and I'm eager to hear all your questions, I would like to start with the question of imagination and basically its limits, because it appears to me that while before you yourself and Helen, you were more bold in, let's say, the language you use in terms of our possible political futures, and now it appears to me that the strategy is to maybe even smuggle some sort of very progressive, potentially, I don't know, revolutionizing ideas into, let's say, the current language or current socio-political reality. So I still want to ask whether I'm wrong or not, or maybe to pose the question of limits of imagination even more straightforwardly. Do you still subscribe to the post-work and post-capitalist ideas? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Absolutely. I think the post-work vision that we set out in our book requires post-capitalism. It requires moving beyond capitalism, particularly that latter aspect around temporal sovereignty. Is really focused upon the creation of different values and the ways of negotiating between different values, things which are just completely excluded by capitalism. I'll give sort of a simple example. So one of the issues we ran into when we were thinking about an alternative to the way in which reproductive labor is organized right now is that the social norms around reproductive labor are, well, they're social. You can't very easily, as an individual, choose to simply step back from them and escape from them. So one of the dominant norms right now is what's called intensive parenting. And one of the most bizarre findings that we came across in the research was that parents are spending more time on their children today than they were back when it was the age of housewives. You've got two parents who are going to work, working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and then spending more time on their children than they ever have, historically speaking. And the key reason why is because parents want their children to have a good life. To get a good life, you need to get a good job. To get a good job, you need to go to a good university. To go to a good university, you need to be training from, when you're a baby sort of thing. And you can, as a parent, sort of say, well, I won't force this upon my kids, but then you also risk potentially harming them if every other parent is doing that sort of thing. So the issue here is around how we as a society choose the values and norms that are driving our reproductive labor. And capitalism simply doesn't allow that sort of thing to happen. You need to move beyond capitalism in order to be able to sort of even question these things and raise them as a viable issue. So I think that there is this post-capitalist vision which is built into it all, perhaps more implicitly than, say, the Accelerationist Manifesto. But it's all there. And, there's ideas in the book around family abolition that are, if you know family abolition, they're straight from the sort of discourses around that. But the term itself sort of lends itself to misreadings and misunderstandings. So we didn't really use that term, even though the core sort of principles have all made it to the book. So I think there's, in our writing, we have a sort of strategic focus of like, how do we convince as many people as possible? But how do we convince people of as radical ideas as possible as well?
Thank you. I'll pick up on that. This kind of interest of yours, of both of you, in seemingly personal or private matters like reproductive work or affective work and household and its maintenance. Do you feel like this is a new, I don't know, wave of interest or paradigm? Can we even, I don't know, speculate about some sort of politics of care after the, politics of identity that we experience today?
Yeah, I don't know if it's entirely opposed to, say, the politics of identity, but I do think care is going to be the dominant issue of the next 40, 50 years, really. Precisely because of those reasons that we cited at the start of the talk. The fact that we need more care as society, that we have aging populations, and that therefore more and more people are going to be doing this work, requiring this work, and that robots and machines and computers simply aren't able to do it, at least not in the ways that we might want as humans. So it seems to me like it's going to be a growing issue. And I think if you know where to look, it's obvious. But if you ask a politician about it, they'll sort of ignore it, simply because it's a massively expensive problem. Paying for the sort of care that's necessary, getting the sort of care that's required, is something that no government wants to talk about because it is such a costly endeavor. And you see even sort of the best case examples of like Nordic welfare states, all of them sort of moving back from the welfare state providing this care labor and instead turning towards families providing this care work. And if you look at a country like Japan, which is sort of quite advanced in terms of demographics, it's a very old population. It has been for a long period of time. They're massively reliant on family care to provide all of this sort of stuff, and they have all sorts of problems that emerge from it as a result. There's lots of elder abuse, there's lots of neglect, there's lots of cases where elderly people just they pass away and nobody notices for years at a time, sort of thing. This is what the likely future is for a lot of countries if we don't grapple with these issues of care and take them seriously. So I think it's going to be a growing issue, and it's going to be hard to ignore as it becomes a bigger and bigger problem. But I would just say I think it's interlinked with the politics of identity precisely because it's so divided between genders in terms of who is sort of expected to take up this care work. So I think it's sort of very highly related to what might be called identity politics.
Yep. This panel or the inspiration forum actually is concerned with technologies, and you gave us a very intriguing account of technologies. It may not have been the focus of yours, but you talked mostly about, I don't know, automation or software jobs, and you even extrapolated that with the actual care. So that's kind of interesting view, even for instance omitting the hype around AI and media technologies or digital technologies. So, and you were, of course, like very critical of this, betting about the techno future. So what would be your expectations from technology? What can we actually expect in terms of technology and care?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things we came across in researching this book was this sort of long history of alternative approaches to technology. Technology that wasn't driven for a long period of time by military interests, particularly during World War II and the subsequent post-war period. It was military interests which were driving the development of technology and the direction of technology. Today is slightly different. I think it's driven by big tech companies that are more focused on surveillance and the collection of personal data as a way to, to try and capture as much wealth and profit as possible. But in both of those cases, it's powerful institutions, non-democratic, unaccountable to the public. It's these organizations which are determining the direction of technological development. But there is this alternative history of people working on, from a sort of bottom-up perspective, of building and developing new technologies for their own needs and not for the needs of the military, for instance. I'll give a couple examples. One is the sort of utopian communities that have existed throughout, particularly in North America. There's some quasi-religious communities who, because they sort of shunned a lot of contemporary technology, ended up building their own sort of technology, which responded very directly to the needs of reproductive workers. So there's all sorts of innovations which eventually spread out to the rest of society around making cooking easier and making cleaning easier, all with a sort of eye to reducing the amount of work that was required, rather than trying to make houses cleaner per se. So there's that sort of history. There's also work around, for instance, the Lucas Plan within the UK, where in the 1970s, workers at an aerospace company who were traditionally building military technology, the company was about to lay off a huge amount of people, and the workers took it into their own hands to develop an alternative way of using all the factory tools and their knowledge and skills that they had to try and build technologies like renewable energy material and to build tools for collective housing and things like this. So it's a really good example of taking the sort of technological infrastructures that we have at the moment and trying to build alternatives. I think I may be cutting out a little bit there. I apologize.
No, it's completely fine. Maybe last question for me before I will give the voice to all of you. And the question that I always somehow struggle myself with, and that's like the role of theory. And you, as both basically theorists, be it like in the domain of political theory or philosophy, maybe even more in particular, you were both connected to what sometimes is being called left acceleration or post acceleration. Maybe just really for the sake of some sort of disambiguation, we can consider very, very simply accelerationism or acceleration as some sort of techno-positive approach that tries to proverbially like work through the problems, which means actually capitalism and technologies and alienation. And while of course like the dark right-wing version wants to just realize the techno-capitalist dystopia, the left version that we may somehow still associate with your manifesto for accelerationist politics, or actually Helen's work together with Laboria Kumunix on xenofeminism. So the left acceleration tends to somehow, diverge the techno-capital evolution in terms of like social progressive goals. So that would be like a very, very hazy definition. But what would be your take, particularly like after acceleration somehow happened and faded away? And in particular, what role of theory do you see in all this?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. So I think part of it was, I've not been in the theory circles for some time now, but part of it was in the 2000s when I was doing my graduate work, there was an upsurge, and maybe a somewhat novel upsurge based around blogs and things like that, of thinking about theory and developing new ideas and taking, some emerging new thinkers and trying to see what could be done with them. I don't know whether that has continued on in some sense, or whether I'm just missing it. I'd be curious to know whether or not there has been any, is there a speculative realism of the 2020s? I don't know. But yeah, from that sort of moment, you had a whole bunch of people who were thinking quite critically about theory, particularly as a rejection of what was at time the dominant sort of post-structuralist approach, everybody, it was mandatory to learn Derrida, and it was a reaction against that sort of stuff. And then the 2008 financial crisis happened, and I think for a lot of people, it became a matter of actually, is theory answering the sorts of questions that we want to ask? Does it provide, a response to what should be done in the face of the 2008 crisis? And I think for many people, it was sort of the answer was no, it doesn't. So there became a sort of this turn from theory towards a more, I want to say, sort of politically, economically oriented approach. And accelerationism, I think, was part and parcel of that. Underpinned by a long history of theory, particularly the work of people like Gilles Deleuze and Mark Fisher, but then applying that and thinking very concretely about how are these ideas instantiated, and without necessarily thinking that you need to engage with Hegel and Heidegger and Derrida in order to be able to talk about what we need to do in the present moment. So that was part and parcel, I think, of accelerationism. And I think it's you can sort of step back and ask theoretical questions about particularly the different divisions between various forms of accelerationism. Nick Land's sort of form of accelerationism versus Alex and I's version versus, today there's venture capitalists have picked up on accelerationism and have used it as like their own slogan. So there's all these different variants, and I think there's interesting questions to be asked about the distinctions between them and sort of how these variants have occurred. But for me, first and foremost is like, how do we make these things effective in the world? How do we avoid just simply talking about ideas for the sake of ideas? And how do we actually carry them out in the world? And in some cases, that means giving up on the term, not talking about it as much. In other cases, that means like, sort of just thinking about specific areas that we might focus on rather than sort of large questions, and sort of making sometimes very specific interventions into a conjuncture precisely in order to try and shape future directions. But I think, I think all of my work continues to be informed by accelerationism. I think Helen's work continues to be informed by xenofeminism, even if we don't necessarily use those terms nearly as much anymore.
Yeah, thank you for clarification. And that's what I actually really enjoy about your work, that no matter whether you, divide it between academic work or more political engagement, you are very much able to like formulate the problem, symptomatize the issues we have like today, and even propose some sort of solution. And the temporal sovereignty seems like a very tempting concept at the moment. But before I will actually still ask you about questions, do you talking to like a Czech or maybe Central European audience, do you feel like there is a difference between, let's say, your perspective from Britain on particularly on these like public luxury or the politics of care, the difference between like let's say Western Europe and let's say Central Europe, and again kind of a conjoint question, like where in all this actually is the current surge of populism, and again like picking up on these family values and care values from the other camp.
So my experience talking to a variety of different countries about a lot of this material is that the ideas do resonate with people, but what's often sort of required is thinking about the local histories of a place. So I give a simple example, which is I was in Argentina a couple months ago and talking about public luxury. And suddenly I was being told about the social tourism thing that Helen mentioned. This program that was started back, I think, in the 1950s, where the government built these large luxury hotels and then made it really cheap for working class families to be able to go and have a vacation for the very first time. And for them, this was public luxury. They were like, look, this is public luxury. And I'm like, I agree. But it's sort of a local history where this principle, this sort of abstract principle, suddenly resonated with them in a way that it might not have otherwise. Same thing goes with the UK. You know, you have to talk about, I don't know, public parks and the history in London of museums being available for free and things like that. In each country, it sort of requires, you know, there is a history of public luxury. There is a history of thinking about, you know, communal care, but it may, sometimes the examples have to sort of change a bit to have them fully resonate with an audience. But in my experience, these ideas do resonate across basically every place that I've been to. Yeah, so it's an interesting it's interesting seeing how it gets taken up by different countries. On the issue of populism and the far right and this family values stuff, I think it's partly a response to this crisis of care and the fact that we need more care. And instead of sort of saying, as we do, that the family is ill-equipped to deal with this crisis of care, instead the argument from the far right is to say, no, the family is the only institution which can respond to this crisis of care. And therefore we need to, you know, push all of this care work back onto the family. And oftentimes explicitly or implicitly arguing that we need a return of very sort of traditional gender divides in order to make the family work as a unit of care. So I think in many ways it's part and parcel of the same conjuncture. It's just a very different response to these problems than what we're advocating for. And I think looking at, you know, the sorts of challenges that families faced during the coronavirus pandemic, when all of this work was pushed onto the family, and the sort of, you know, tensions that simmered and the explosions within families that happened, all of this sort of stuff shows that the family can't provide all of this care, and it shouldn't provide all of this care. There are better ways for society to do this sort of thing, and we need to be thinking about these alternatives rather than trying to force family values back onto people.
Oh, thank you. And finally, there's space for your questions. So who wants to ask first? No one, really? Okay, we have a mic there.
So, hi. Well, it's more of a topic than a question maybe, but for me, I feel that mental health is a great topic that I didn't hear when you or Helen were talking about. How does it relate to these issues? If you can maybe talk about that a little. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I would say that it's sort of somewhat implicit in a lot of the work, because a lot of the problems that we're talking about are the sort of intense pressures of care that are forced upon people. So whether it be families or whether it be care workers or, you know, all sorts of different groups that are taking up this work. And it is mentally exhausting and it is emotionally exhausting. And, you know, as in the book, we go through some of the challenges that care workers take up, particularly people who have to look after, somebody with long-term care needs who require sort of 24/7 care. And the people who have to look after, you know, whether it be a spouse or a parent or a child or something like that, the people who have to look after, care for these people 24/7, it's incredibly difficult and incredibly stressful, and it can be financially ruinous, and it can be a massive impediment to having any sort of social life. So mental health is sort of one of the expressions of this crisis of care that we talk about. And the idea would be that these alternative forms of care do provide a sort of way to ameliorate these problems and try and fix some of the issues of mental health today. I don't think our proposals are going to solve every mental health issue, but I do think that in some circumstances that Communalizing care, for instance, can have a very large impact on the stress that people feel in their lives.
Yeah, another question here.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentation. And I wanted to ask, how hopeful are you personally about how many people are ready for this rethinking of society? If this is something that you see as a long-term goal, 10, 20, 50 years maybe, or is this something that you feel like we should, well, definitely start working on now, but that we are already in that place? How do you view that? Thank you.
I mean, on one level, I'm pessimistic, despite trying to write really hopeful stories about the future. I think the ideas of this book are a long-term project. And one of the challenges that we came across in writing was, how do we write an alternative vision of the future that isn't, on one hand, a blueprint for the future to say, this is exactly what we need to do. And on the other hand, a sort of vision of the future that doesn't say much at all, which is sort of typical of academics. You get to the end of a book and you have 2 pages devoted towards what the alternative might be. We wanted to avoid doing either of those things. So we focused on these 3 principles as a way of thinking about what we want for the future society, but also as sort of a way to judge what immediate actions are doing right now. So do they get us closer? Do they align with these principles? Or do they take us further away from the ideal future that we might want? So there's sort of, the 3 principles are meant to be like a guide for immediate action, but also principles for constructing a future society. So I think, realistically, the goals will take decades to probably carry out, but that doesn't mean that actions can't be taken immediately to try and give people more free time right now, and to give people more options for communal care, to give people more options for public luxury and things like that. All of that can be done right now, even if ultimately it requires overthrowing capitalism and completely reorganizing society.
Yeah. But before doing that, we have another question.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have a follow-up on this because I wanted to ask, what are the strategies precisely now? Because I understand your role is to write the book, to give us the narrative, and I think you did a great job there. But I wonder, so is it now up to some experiments that will be performed by most probably people like us, with abolishing family, with sharing care, with doing some of these like very progressive and experimental things? But on the other hand, doesn't it increase the chasm that we are facing in identity politics? Doesn't it make us even weirder and even less understandable to all the other people to whom some of these measures might be addressed in terms of improving their lives? And if not the experimentation, is there a way for pushing these policies publicly? Because you said it yourself, it's very expensive and it's very difficult from the current point of view. So yeah, what's your ideas about the strategies now?
Yeah, I missed the last part of that. Thank you to my internet. But you're absolutely right. What are the sort of the strategies for it? So I do think immediate experiments can be useful. I do think pushing for changes at a state-based level are also extremely useful. I think organizing around, so when Alex and I wrote Inventing the Future, the whole sort of narrative was against work. And one of the things we found when we went and talked to people about the book was inevitably somebody would say, but I like work. I don't want to be against work. And, the sort of implicit idea also being that the opposite of work is just sitting on the couch all day. So when Helen and I wrote this book, it wasn't necessarily against work. It's instead the fight for free time is the subtitle of the book. And this, I think, is a really, it's a value that I think a lot of people can get on board with, even if they, enjoy their job. They still want more free time to choose what to do with their lives. And you're seeing unions start to pick this up across Europe, in North America a bit as well. But there's more focus on, the amount of working hours, so-called work-life balance, things like this. So there is, I think, sort of the foundations being built for thinking about how do we deal with the amount of work that we do and how do we reduce it. The other aspect is that care is going to become a more and more pressing concern. And I think it will entail and require that every sort of group that's involved to think about it. So whether it be trade unions, whether it be social movements, whether it be political parties, whether it be think tanks, whether it be experimental communes, everybody is going to be having to think about how do we respond to the crisis of care and developing alternatives and trying to, experiment with new options. So I think the circumstances are going to sort of force us to have to experiment in any case, and try and find ways to the future. The other thing I would say is that in many, many countries across the world, one of the reasons why the far right is on the rise is because they sort of offer a narrative that helps people explain their current circumstances, gives people a group to blame, and offers a vision for the future of how things might be better. And I think for the left, we need to become better at offering those narratives as well. And I think a key way to do that is by offering more free time. Making freedom and free time a core value of the leftist project in our vision for the future. And then suddenly we can, it's a narrative which I think is compelling to a lot of people. And it's something which can help fight against the far right and the populist turn and things like that. So yeah, in terms of strategy, I think all of that. And then lastly, I'll just say, as we have more and more people doing care work as a wage position, they're the front lines of the working class nowadays. It's not factory workers anymore. It's not people in coal mines. It's people in nursing homes. It's people doing home care work. It's these sorts of people which are now at the front lines of the working class today. And I think helping those people to organize, building, solidarity across different fractions of the working class, but building solidarity as well across different elements of the care chain. So immigrants coming in to look after, people's children and do things like that. This care chain spans across the globe, and we need to be building solidarity across borders as well for it.
Thank you for these optimistic words. We still have some time, and another question here in the first row.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I wanted to ask about technology, one more question, and maybe about the more like smart technology or automated technology that we have at our homes. Because I can imagine, as you were describing the nuclear family, I also cannot imagine using this smart tech and automated tech in our homes for the profit of the nuclear family, in terms of using it in the kitchen and for the child care and things like that. And maybe it can be more imaginable in the communal living and communal care, that we can use these like smart technologies and do it like in a bigger, put them in the bigger picture when we are trying to take care of the kids or take care of the family. So do you think that these aspects of bringing this kind of technology to homes and especially to kitchens are like intertwined?
Yeah, it's so smart homes, I think, do have some potential, and I mean, I've always enjoyed playing with technology, so I always, I'm always looking into smart home stuff to see if it can be of any use to me. But one thing which becomes really obvious when you have a family in smart home technology is that they're not designed for collectives at all. They're designed for individuals. And I'll give you a very simple, silly example, which is playing music through a smart speaker and asking it to play a song. And suddenly my Spotify playlist just wants to recommend children's music to me all the time. These things aren't designed for families. They're designed for one person. There's almost a sort of bachelor perspective that's taken up by these technologies. And I imagine in a more collective situation beyond the family, it would be even more difficult. That being said, I do think there's a lot of potential there for a more collective sort of use of these technologies. You can imagine them being used to, if you've got collective cooking and collective cleaning, they could be used to help organize that and make it easier and ensure that everybody's taking up their fair share of responsibilities. You can imagine sort of ways of doing that, I think, with smart technologies. But the current wave of these technologies is not built for that whatsoever. They're so focused on the individual and not focused on a family, let alone a collective at all.
Are you holding up? You both and Helen? Can we still have like 1 or 2 questions?
I'm all good, yeah.
Great. So who wants to join the discussion?
Okay, I have a question here in the back. Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about free time, yeah? So you seem to be putting a lot of aspiration to this concept of free time, but I have to admit that I struggle to understand what it even means, yeah? And so I guess my question is, do you see free time as fundamentally opposed as care or care work? And you know, the reason I'm asking is that I'm afraid that free time can easily become, you know, an ideology for us to, you know, be individual, highly, you know, engage in highly individualized consumer activities that are, you know, harmful from all kinds of point of view, ecological and so on. So I mean, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's to a large extent a consumer ideology, yeah? Or free time is really not easily, cannot be easily dissociated from consumer ideology. So I wonder, like, what ideas about free time do you have? What do we do? What should we do in that free time? And how you know, how do we separate this idea of free time from care, if it's even possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're absolutely right that free time, as it's understood today, is largely consumerist and individualist. So when we talk about public luxury, one of the things that public luxury is responding to is precisely this question of what do we do with our free time? So having public parks, having public pools, having, you know, public tourism, having public museums, and all of these sorts of things are an answer to that question of what do we do with our free time. We can't simply build a world where we're given all this free time and then we're spending all our money on, you know, whatever, Netflix or something like that. The alternative is to build these publicly available, freely available, or heavily subsidized systems that enable us to spend our free time in enjoyable ways. And a lot of those examples are what we might call leisure. So sitting by a pool doing nothing is pretty leisurely. But then we also need systems where we might collectively decide to take up, you know, hobbies together. And not just sort of individual hobbies, but hobbies where we might want to contribute to, you know, large collective projects that are, you know, organized around developing a technology or developing, you know, research in health or developing, you know, an artistic pursuit or something like that. This is where I think Martin Hägglund's book, This Life, is really, really useful, precisely because it argues against the necessity of the sort of individualist conception of free time and really focuses on the ways in which we have to collectively determine the answer to the question of what do we want to do with our time, that it can't simply be answered individually, that it requires that we build these institutions to answer it socially, and that we build ways in which we can socially live together to maximize free time. But by free time here, I mean not doing nothing. I mean free time in the sense of autonomously choosing what to do. So you asked about care work, and it's one of the most difficult ones because for my children, for instance, is that free time when I'm changing a nappy, or is that, you know, is that work? And in many ways, it's actually a bit of both, because I freely chose to have children knowing full well what was entailed as a result of it. So that sort of labor is an autonomous choice of my own, and in that sense, it's free time. It's part and parcel of committing myself to this project of raising a child. So in that sense, you know, it is part and parcel of my free time. When I'm at work, though, and when I'm being told that I have to be in at a certain time and I have to do certain things, and, you know, For instance, if you're working at a grocery store and you're being told you have to go stock shelves at 5 in the morning, that's not free time. You're not under control of what you're doing with your time there. So for us, free time it's collective, it's social, it's about autonomous choice first and foremost.
Thank you for an answer. Maybe we have still time for one more question. Right. Well, if not, I still wonder. Oh, there is actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask about. I would like to follow on this last question, because I would like to ask about voluntary work, because I see it as some concept of between this like labor and free time, and I would like to ask you more about what do you think about like volunteers social, for example, volunteer social service, or these concepts.
I think it's free time because you're autonomously choosing to do this sort of material. But I think the issue under the current circumstances, in the UK, for instance, there was a real effort by the Conservative government 10 years ago to get more and more people volunteering for, sort of care work and things like that. But it was precisely as a way so that they could cut the welfare state. So getting people to do this work for free so that you don't have to pay people to do it. So I think that's the risk at the current moment, is that a Conservative government could very easily, use this as a way to further sort of anti-welfare state thinking, to further austerity, and to further place responsibilities and pressures on people that they haven't freely chosen. So it's difficult, but I think it can be quite useful, and I can imagine quite easily in a future future society that many of us would spend a lot of our time doing some sort of work. We would want to be getting involved in something which might appear to be work, but we find immensely enjoyable and pleasurable, and therefore want to do more of it. And perhaps, because of our paid jobs right now, we can't do more of it. So that's, the future that we see for a post-work society isn't a world of, absent, free of effort. It's one that could be intensely, challenging and difficult, but it's one where we've freely made the choices about those challenges.
Okay. I'm still looking into the audience, whether there is some hands or question. Yeah, I have a signal, time signal. Maybe just a way to summarize a tiny bit. What I really enjoy about your work, about this particular talk, and how I would even kind of represent what were the actual questions from the audience. There is this kind of tension in between, like using very colloquial, words or concepts like family, like free time, and maybe disentangling them or remapping them or relabeling them. And you've done so with work or with what you term folk politics, and what is tiny bit connected to like demonstration and street level politics. Helen, she did that in terms of maybe gender, sex, or family. And now we're actually, remapping free time and realizing to what extent it actually is free. So I think that this kind of relabeling or remapping may be something we can take from this evening, and some sort of relevance of what you both with Helen do, or what we can do while actually critically re-examining the life we are currently having. So that for me would be a summary, maybe. I don't know if you have a punchline at the moment.
I mean, fight for free time in every way that you can. Fight for free time.
Yes.
If your employer wants you to work longer, tell them no. Yeah, that's it.